Welcome all. I guess you would say this is the kickoff to what has become Brazil Week in New York with this event. I'm Ted Helms. I'm the Executive Director of the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, and really just want to extend a welcome and really to recognize FGV and what they do. In many ways, I think they help supplement and support what the Chamber itself tries to do, which is to bring interesting content, ideas, thoughts, and create greater understanding between Brazil and the United States that encourages greater trade and investment and opportunities for all. With just those remarks, and just happy to be here and happy to have the FGV put together a very outstanding event, I'm going to turn this over to Cesar. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Welcome and thank you for your presence. FGV and myself are very pleased to host you here, since 2012. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Carlos Ivan Simões Leal, President of the FGV. We also have Mr. Bruno Covas, Mayor of the City of São Paulo, Mr. Alejandro Werner, Director of the Western Hemisphere Department of IMF, Mr. Carlos Geraldo Langoni, Director of the World Economic Center of FGV and former President of the Central Bank of Brazil. We are very honored to count with your participation. Thank you. As you may know, FGV is one of the world's most important think tanks. Our global reach makes us a key vehicle to knowledge production and diffusion in favor of Brazil's national development. Therefore, encouraging discussions such as this one is the core of our mission. The World Economy in Brazil series, which we are now open, is part of our annual calendar of events since 2012. Today marks the 7th edition. We have been building the legacy together with our long-standing partner, Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, that I deeply appreciate. A successful partnership that has allowed us to jointly host remarkable personalities from the economic and political scenarios and of both countries throughout these years. We believe that the platform created through this event is very meaningful and engaged with businessmen, investors, and opinion makers to reinforce their views about Brazil. Our objective is to bridge that gap because we really see opportunities throughout this continental powerhouse. This week, we are celebrating the nomination of the Person of the Year Award to the Brazilian judge Sérgio Moro and Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City. Congratulations. Indeed, our event is very timely as Brazil faces perhaps a very important moment of its contemporary story. General elections are scheduled to be held in October 2018. I'm sure this is a topic that is on everybody's mind, and today we will discuss it, but we will also discuss other objectives too. Mr. Carlos Ivan Simões Leal will talk about geopolitics and the Brazilian context. Mayor of São Paulo explained the dynamics of doing business in São Paulo. And Alejandro Werner, Director of IMF, will present an overview of the world economy with emphasis in Latin America. Moreover, we have here our colleague, Professor Carlos Langoni, who will address the economic scenarios of Brazil. After the speech, I will open the floor for a Q&A. As a conclusion, I would like to thank our audience, our special guest in particular, the entire delegation of São Paulo City Hall, Juan Quiroz, President of the São Paulo Business Agency and advisor Ricardo Santana, and Mr. Wilson Point, Secretary of Desastatization. I'd like to thank you, Ambassador Enio Caldeira, Consul General in New York, Ernesto Lozada, our colleague and President for IPEA, the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, the special support from Financial Times, our media partner, Aldo Flores, member of the board of FGV, and FGV Director Cirian Gonzalez, and Carlos Augusto and Alexandre Moretti for their commitment to this event. I hope you enjoyed the discussion here today, and thank you all for coming. President Casavan, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning to everyone. I hope you had a nice breakfast. As you are aware, Brazil is not a main actor in international geopolitics. It's, according to the Chinese, it's a far, far away land, is actually the name of Brazil in Chinese. And if we stare at global numbers, we will see that our current rate of growth makes us even less important. We are important as a world supplier of raw materials, but we have receded along the last 10, 15 years in terms of manufactured goods. Unemployment is very high. Of course, Brazil is getting out of a recession, but it's a slow mover. It's getting out very, very, very slowly. Inflation seems to have been tamed, and I emphasize the word seems. We still have to see what happens if the economy heats up a little bit. And we are a country very much unprepared for geopolitical risks. We export, we trade 25% of our trade, 23, 25, with China. And currently, as you are aware, this country, the United States, is not in the best mood with China. So, if a strong trade war develops, no one knows what's going to be the impact on Brazilian trade accounts. We trade a lot with the Middle East, with Asia, with Europe. I don't see any danger with Europe right now, except for a shock that has a very, very small probability of happening. And of course, we have the economic risks. Protectionism, oil prices increases, inflation rise, higher interest rates, and so forth. A mild oil price increase would do good to Brazil. A very strong oil price increase would do a lot of harm because it would implicitly imply on a fall of demand for some of the Brazilian products. Currently, if we look around the world, Brazil has not many tensions to face, local tensions. One is Venezuela. I presume everyone is aware of what is happening in Venezuela, and that in Brazil we have received between 40 and 80,000 Venezuelans. No one is sure about the right number across our borders. Venezuela is a failing state, and it may continue to be a failing state for some years, meaning that we will get more and more Venezuelans into Brazil, and we are not prepared for that. And of course, we have a big challenge in a very important partner. It's not a geopolitical risk, but it's an economic risk. Is Argentina going to make her own fiscal adjustment? Is that going to set an example for us to follow? Or is it going to do the opposite? The fight between the people linked to former President Cristina Kirchner and current President Macri is there. And it is about the same fight that we may see in Brazil. With Brexit, with migration in Europe, with many Brazilians migrating because of the current economic crisis, usually young, capable people, We are not in the best shape, but on the other hand, we are arriving at that point where the important discussions are starting to take place. First discussion, put crooks in jail. That is happening. It's not perfect, but we have sent a former president to jail, a very important former president. We are still discussing the reform of our pension system. I don't believe that's going to happen during this government, but the next year or so, we will have to face that discussion. And that is not a manna from heaven. That is just a chance to begin the real discussion, which is to change our budgetary process. Amazingly enough, and for Americans, that is one of those taken for granted underlying assumptions that are not true in Brazil. Amazingly enough, our budget is not a real budget. The legislative votes a budget, and then the government, the executive power, has authority not to follow that budget. It cannot spend more than the budget says, but it may spend less by not doing the policies that were implicit behind the budget. So, at the end, simplifying the whole discussion, we shall be discussing in the near future, and there are already people starting to talk about this, how do we take strategic decisions in Brazil? How are they taken and how are they implemented? This is very important because if we want to grow more, we have to create credibility. And credibility doesn't come from a single person. It comes from a body, a large body of people. So, making it short, it's a difficult time. It's not over yet, the difficulties, but it seems that we see some light at the end of a tunnel. Depending on the results of the election, and I don't see the elections as such a dangerous door to open or and cross. Depending on the results of the election, we will enter the discussion on budget deficit next year, and we will enter the discussion of a budgetary process in the next 3 or 4 years. During the next tenure, we will see that. At the same time, we will see Brazil trying to get into the OECD. We will see Brazil trying to settle a trade agreement with Europe. We will see Brazil opening itself more. Why? Because no matter who is elected, it's absolutely necessary if you want to cut down unemployment. So Brazil will slowly have to become more competitive. At the end, we will be, I presume, investing more in our military. Brazilian military are understaffed and under-equipped. And this will also push the economy. We are finishing the first sub built in Brazil, partially with French technology, and we are going to revamp our Navy. We are going to revamp our armed forces for purposes exclusively and solely of defense. We have been in peace for 160 years, and Brazil has no intention of invading or doing anything harmful to any country. Doesn't even want to dictate anything to anyone. It just wants to avoid others of interfering in Brazil. So this is about all I had to say. We see that our most important region of interest nowadays is exactly the same as the US. What happens in the South China Sea will affect our trade surplus. If the US and China decide not to come to an agreement and things become more difficult there, it will affect us enormously. Our second region of interest is Europe. Why? Because of this Brexit thing, no one knows really where it's going. We feel a tremendous pressure of the UK trying to open markets for itself in Brazil, and we see the same thing happening, the Germans doing the same thing in Brazil. And that's about it. Thank you very much.
É um grande prazer poder estar aqui a convite da FGV, Projetos e da Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. Aproveito para comentar o professor Carlos Ivan Simons Leal, presidente da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, em nome de quem saúdo todos os presentes. Falar num evento como esse, organizado por uma das maiores instituições de pesquisa do Brasil e do mundo, em parceria com a Câmara de Comércio e o Financial Times, jornal que todos admiram e, acima de tudo, é uma oportunidade de diálogo com formadores de opinião altamente qualificados e também com o mercado internacional. Depois de 10 anos como membro do Parlamento, primeiro como deputado estadual e depois como deputado federal, é com muito entusiasmo que hoje sou prefeito da cidade de São Paulo. Esse é meu primeiro pronunciamento internacional oficial desde que assumi a prefeitura 38 dias atrás. Conforme dita a nossa Constituição, tomei à frente a prefeitura após a saída do prefeito João Dória, que se prepara para concorrer ao cargo de governador do estado de São Paulo. Assim, gostaria, com esse pronunciamento, de estabelecer o diálogo, dizer que estamos de braços abertos para novos parceiros internacionais e deixar claro quais são os objetivos da nossa gestão. Vale dizer que não houve e nem haverá ruptura na administração da prefeitura e nas metas da nossa gestão, que foram pactuadas entre o governo municipal e a população da cidade de São Paulo de forma transparente e participativa. Haverá, sim, um estilo novo. Um estilo que trabalhará para consolidar o que já foi iniciado e intensificar medidas para o bem-estar da população. Objetivo máximo da nossa administração. O perfil do Brasil mudou muito nas últimas décadas e o perfil da cidade de São Paulo também. Mas nossa cidade, com 12 milhões e meio de habitantes, dentro de uma região metropolitana de 21 milhões de habitantes, continua em nossas tradições e raízes, o nosso espírito empreendedor. São Paulo floresceu com o café, foi a primeira cidade do país a se industrializar e hoje passa para um novo patamar, preparando-se para a quarta revolução industrial. Nossa cidade tem uma identidade muito única. É uma cidade jovem e empreendedora. É a porta de entrada do Brasil e da América do Sul para muitas empresas, turistas e imigrantes. São Paulo é a maior cidade das Américas e do Hemisfério Sul, com uma região metropolitana que gera 18,5% do PIB brasileiro e 7% das exportações nacionais. Sediamos, na cidade de São Paulo, 65% das multinacionais presentes no país e também nos orgulhamos de ser um polo de startups. Com boa infraestrutura, estamos próximos ao melhor sistema de estradas do Brasil, portos e aeroportos, como o Aeroporto Internacional de Guarulhos e o Porto de Santos, os principais gateways da América Latina. A cidade se consolida como o maior polo econômico do Brasil, tendo em vista que cedia uma das maiores bolsas de valores do mundo e é líder em investimentos diretos na América Latina desde 2003. No que tange ao potencial turístico, recebemos mais de 13 milhões de turistas por ano, que ocupam os 42 mil quartos de hotel oferecidos pela cidade. Além disso, possuímos uma estrutura de 15 mil restaurantes que ofertam cardápios nacionais e internacionais. Segundo o IPC Maps, a cidade de São Paulo representa o maior mercado consumidor brasileiro. Em nosso trabalho de fomento aos negócios, nos esforçamos para criar um ambiente cada vez melhor aos empreendedores e investidores, tentando reduzir a burocracia. Nosso desejo é que a cidade de São Paulo continue a ser o motor da cultura do empreendedorismo no Brasil e seja cada vez mais apta a receber investimentos nacionais e internacionais. São Paulo é uma cidade inovadora. Nossos investimentos nas áreas de inovação e tecnologia têm sido grandes. Uma de nossas ações, visando a ser um destino cada vez mais atrativo para empresas, é o programa Empreenda Fácil, que possibilitou a redução de tempo de abertura de empresas, que levava, em média, mais de 100 dias para, no máximo, 5 dias na cidade de São Paulo. Outro destaque da nossa gestão é o programa Trabalho Novo, que tem incluído milhares de pessoas em situação de rua no mercado de trabalho, impactado de forma positiva. Através de uma série de cursos de capacitação e apoio psicológico, pessoas em situação de vulnerabilidade social estão conseguindo se incluir no mercado de trabalho e ter renda própria. Para melhorar cada vez mais esse ambiente, também acreditamos na transparência de dados e na aproximação do governo com a população e a sociedade civil. Nesse sentido, o programa São Paulo Aberta, coordenado pela Secretaria Municipal de Relações Internacionais, em parceria com a Controladoria Geral do município e a Secretaria Municipal de Inovação e Tecnologia, tem sido o principal motor dessa política, formando agentes de governo aberto que auxiliam nesse processo de abertura e, consequentemente, de transparência e combate à corrupção. No último ano, trabalhamos para desenvolver o primeiro plano de ação em governo aberto da cidade, realizado em parceria com a Open Government Partnership, para fomentar a participação social, a transparência, a prestação de contas e o fortalecimento das instituições municipais. Esse é mais um esforço para incluir os cidadãos nas discussões sobre a cidade e permitir que eles também possam procurar desenvolver soluções. Outra de nossas prioridades é o maior e mais ousado programa de desestatização municipal da história do país. Encabeçado pela recém-criada Secretaria Municipal de Desestatização e Parcerias, o programa prevê a privatização e concessão de diversos ativos e equipamentos da Prefeitura e permitirá que nos concentremos em investimentos sociais, na educação e na saúde. A ideia é que o programa desonere a Prefeitura da cidade de São Paulo de gastos desnecessários, equilibrando as nossas contas e possibilitando melhorar a oferta e qualidade dos serviços públicos. Com isso, prevemos arrecadar nesta gestão até 1 bilhão e 500 milhões de dólares. Nesse quesito, estamos avançando com a privatização do Centro de Convenções do AMB, detentor de uma área de 360 mil metros quadrados. O AMB tem vocação para abrigar grandes eventos de diversas naturezas. Atualmente, é palco do Carnaval da cidade de São Paulo e de diversos shows internacionais. Ao conceder este equipamento para a iniciativa privada, nós pretendemos aumentar o potencial construtivo da sua área e permitir novas possibilidades de utilização. A chamada pública para manifestação de interesses se iniciará em agosto desse ano. Outro foco de privatização são os ativos imobiliários pertencentes à Prefeitura, localizados em áreas estratégicas da cidade. Nosso governo possui grande quantidade de imóveis subutilizados e desocupados, que geram gastos ao município. A ideia é vender estes imóveis para interessados, diminuindo o ônus gerado pela sua manutenção. Os recursos levantados com as privatizações e concessões são todos destinados ao Fundo Municipal de Desenvolvimento Social, com recursos a serem investidos em saúde, educação, habitação, transporte, assistência social e segurança pública. Igualmente, estamos avançando em outros projetos de privatização, concessão e parceria pública e privada, de parques e mercados municipais, de terminais de ônibus, do sistema de tarifa dos ônibus municipais, da rede pública de Wi-Fi, da limpeza urbana, de corredores de ônibus, de cemitérios e do serviço funerário. O projeto de modernização da gestão inclui a gestão, a operação e a manutenção do estádio de futebol da cidade, o Pacaembu, que está em processo de consulta pública, sendo preparado para um chamamento de investidores interessados na concessão que vai durar 35 anos. O Autódromo de Interlagos, o maior dos ativos públicos contidos nesse programa de desestatização, possui 950 mil metros quadrados. A partir da sua concessão, pretendemos permitir um total de 480 mil metros quadrados de área construída, que incluirá prédios residenciais, de escritórios e comerciais, hotéis, moradias populares e um parque de acesso público. Estamos também com um chamamento aberto para investidores interessados na concessão de uma área do aeroporto de Campo de Marte para a estruturação de um parque e um museu aeroespacial, que se tornarão áreas de lazer e esportes com pistas de corrida e ciclovias e um local exclusivo de exposições e eventos. Será o 5º maior parque da cidade de São Paulo. A Prefeitura está recebendo também propostas para o primeiro e pioneiro projeto de parceria público-privada internacional para a construção de habitação de interesse social. A PPP prevê a construção de 34 mil novas moradias em 6 anos, junto com a construção de serviços importantes para o bem-estar da população ao seu redor, como postos de saúde, escolas, creches e comércio. A proposta do projeto é conciliar a construção de moradias com estratégias de desenvolvimento urbano, aproximando oferta de emprego e mão de obra, bem como população dos serviços fundamentais. Não posso terminar aqui sem antes aproveitar a oportunidade de convidar a todos para estarem amanhã no São Paulo Investment Day, dentro do Council of the Americas. Em consonância com os temas centrais da agenda internacional, vamos priorizar o desenvolvimento urbano sustentável da nossa cidade. O fórum que inaugurarei amanhã se insere dentro desta perspectiva na medida em que contribui para a geração de riqueza e de empregos, criando um círculo virtuoso de mais empregos e mais riqueza. Saúde, educação, bem-estar social, privatizações, incentivo a investimentos nacionais e estrangeiros, desenvolvimento sustentável, inovação e tecnologia são as prioridades da nossa gestão. Estou certo de que nossa cidade assumirá cada vez mais protagonismo internacional pelas robustas políticas que estamos implementando e pelo diálogo aberto com o setor privado. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me and sharing with you our outlook for the world economy and our outlook for Latin America. And with that, I mean, I would like to say that we're seeing Latin America coming out of the recession that it experienced in 2015, 2016, as the two largest Southern Cone economies were getting out of their own recessions, Brazil and Argentina. Obviously, recently, Argentina ran into some difficulties on their funding side that I will comment a little bit further on the presentation. But, I mean, overall, we're seeing Latin America picking up gradually on the back of the fixing of idiosyncratic problems in its main economies, and on the back of an external environment that is positive for the region, as commodity prices are picking back up, as financial conditions, although tightening, continue to be, from a historical point of view, relatively supportive of investment in the region. Declining inflation has allowed the major central banks in Latin America to significantly reduce interest rates, and with this support a recovery in consumption that will follow with a recovery of investment. Summarizing, I mean, the main risk that we see for the region, obviously, on the one hand, is the tightening of financial conditions coming from the advanced economies. Secondly, as was mentioned in the introductory remarks here, the potential trade conflicts that might arise in the region. And while that uncertainty is taking place, that uncertainty is weighing on investment throughout the world as well. And therefore, it's not only the materialization of the trade war, but the uncertainty of what the rules of the game are going to be regarding trade that might be affecting the economy in the present. Third, I would say from a domestic point of view, in Latin America, we have in 2018 a very heavy electoral calendar. I mean, there are elections in Brazil, there are elections in Mexico, there are elections in Colombia. So we have, I mean, almost 2/3 or more than 2/3 of the populations in Latin America electing a new government, and many of those elections are also generating some sort of important uncertainty that is also having an effect on each country's economies. So let me look a little bit to the numbers and tell you that we're expecting the world economy to grow at around 4% in 2018 and 2019. We're expecting the major advanced economies to have a relatively strong economic performance in these 2 years. We're expecting the US to grow at 2.9% this year and 2.7% next year. We're expecting the euro area to continue growing above 2% in the next 2 years. And we're seeing the emerging markets growing at around 5%, on the back of a Chinese economy that has been able to maintain a rate of growth at around 6.5%, while it's slowly transitioning from a heavily investment-led growth process, a heavy, intense manufacturing growth process, into a growth process that is slightly less driven by investment, is slightly less driven by heavy manufacturing and more driven by light manufacturing and services. And also the Chinese economy is trying to, I wouldn't call it delever, but at least to significantly reduce the rate of growth of leverage in the Chinese economy. One of the most important vulnerabilities in the Chinese economy is that it has been able to maintain these very high rates of growth at the cost in the last 7 years of increasing financial vulnerability. Financial intermediation to the private sector has doubled, more than doubled, in the last 10 years in China, basically as a major pillar of their growth strategy after the global financial crisis was basically switching from a more export-led growth to a domestic-led growth that was driven by a heavy investment strategy, and that heavy investment strategy requires significant increases in investment, and that investment, part of it, is of questionable quality, therefore creating doubts regarding the capacity to repay the debt with which it was financed. So an important challenge for the Chinese economy is to very gradually slow down the rate of growth to a much more sustainable level, as it is doing, switching on the aggregate demand side from heavy investment more to consumption, all of these at a time in which they continue to reduce their dependency on debt to fuel their growth process, and this is taking place at a slightly slower speed than what my colleagues in the Asian department has been recommended, but it's taking place. It has been taking place in the last 2 years, and obviously two of the major emerging market economies went from negative growth to positive growth in the last 24 months, basically Russia and Brazil, and that is explaining the acceleration that we're seeing in the EM growth rate. So basically we're expecting two relatively good years in 2018 and 2019 from the point of view of growth in the world economy. Just focusing a little bit on the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy, as you can see on this slide, the first graph shows you the rate of growth of the U.S. economy, that is the blue line, and the orange columns is the output gap, the difference between current GDP and what we estimate to be potential GDP in the U.S. So basically what we're saying in that graph is that the U.S. economy is growing at, as I said before, at 2.9 this year and 2.7 next year, but that the U.S. economy is operating above potential. So a U.S. economy that was already operating above potential now is being subject to the continuation of relatively loose monetary policy, although the Fed is normalizing its monetary policy at a gradual pace, but more than that, to a significant fiscal stimulus coming in on the back of the important tax reform that was implemented in the U.S. at the beginning of this year, and the budget agreements that were also passed in the first few months of 2018. These, in cumulative terms, will push growth by around 1.2 percentage points in 3 years. So part of that 1.2 will happen in 2018, and that's incorporated in the forecast that I already gave you. Part will materialize in 19 and part in 20, but basically the U.S. economy is getting a U.S. economy that was already growing at a healthy pace is getting a significant push from the fiscal side, and that is why we're seeing these rates of growth that are significantly higher than the medium-term sustainable rate of growth in the U.S. that we calculated to be around 1.7 and 1.9%. That obviously, as you can see on the graph in the middle, is helping to generate an unemployment rate that is significantly below the steady state unemployment rate for the U.S. economy. That might generate in the future inflationary pressures, and that is why the Fed, in anticipation for that, is normalizing its interest rate, and it has also started to normalize its balance sheet, and that is also contributing to a widening of the current account deficit and global imbalances in the U.S., as can be shown on the slide on the last graph on that slide. So, in a nutshell, the U.S. economy is doing well from the point of view of growth. However, from a medium-term perspective, is exacerbating a little bit the risks of that an overheating economy will generate. Maybe surprises on the upside on the inflation front, a widening of the current account deficit, and therefore global imbalances that may give rise to even more important trade tensions in the future, and some spots of financial vulnerability in which the significant increase in leverage that has taken place in the last, not in leverage, the significant increase in financial intermediation with deteriorating credit conditions or credit quality conditions by significantly reducing the covenants in bond contracts, going into even riskier projects, etc., is at the margin also increasing those vulnerabilities and generating some risks for the future. Positive news in the U.S. economy: investment that was relatively slow throughout the first and medium stages of the recovery has really gained strength, even before the tax reform, and obviously with the tax reform that introduces a significant boost to investment through the full expensing of investment in taxes, that is going to generate a significant advancement of investment in the U.S. in the next few years. Let me move now to Latin America. As I said before, we're expecting Latin America to continue its acceleration from a minus half a percentage point growth in 2016, then 1.3 in 2017, 2% this year, and 2.8% next year. If we take out Venezuela, that is having extreme negative rates, these rates would be 2.6% this year and 3% next year. Almost every country, as you can see in the map, is basically showing positive rates of growth. The only country that is experiencing a negative rate of growth is Venezuela, that we're expecting that for a second year in a row it will contract at 15%. Cumulative at the end of this year, the Venezuelan economy would have contracted almost 50% in a span of 4 or 5 years. That is one of the largest economic disasters, and it was mentioned before, a governance, humanitarian, and economic disaster that, is very hard to find in our database in the last 15 years. And as you can see, in the last part of this table, we're expecting the two largest economies in Latin America, Brazil and Mexico, to grow at around 2.3%, both of them this year, and accelerate a little bit more into 2019 on the back of the recovery in commodity prices, on the recovery or acceleration that we're seeing this year in the U.S. economy, and the decline in electoral uncertainty that is also weighing on investment in both of these economies. As I said in my introduction, part of the recovery of Latin America was idiosyncratic factors on those economies that were undergoing recessions, but from an external point of view, we have seen an important recovery in external demand, as it is shown on the red line on that slide, that obviously generated an important increase in exports, an important recovery in commodity terms of trade. The graph in the middle shows the deep decline that the terms of trade had, and those are the purple bars in the graphs, and how much of that has already recovered in the last 2 years, shown by the green dots. And still supportive financial conditions, as can be seen in the last graph, by relatively low corporate and sovereign spreads and relatively high PE ratios in the stock market. From the aggregate demand side, and on average, those are the contribution of each aggregate demand component to growth in Latin America. I will focus just on the graphs on the year 16, 17, and 18. You can see how the moving growth from negative growth, that is the black diamond, in 2016 to positive growth in 2017 was basically led by a significant recovery in consumption, that is the purple block in that line. And in 2018, we're expecting that this is going to be complemented by an important recovery in investment, that is the red dot, as the corporate sector feels that this recovery is much more sustainable as interest rates continue to decline, and also as the world economy and trade in the world economy continue to strengthen. As I said before, and this is just, basically the numbers, this has been facilitated by a more accommodative monetary policy as inflation really jumped up in the region on the back of exchange rate depreciation, some adjustment in public sector prices, etc., like 2 or 3 years ago. Now inflation is coming down pretty rapidly. The first graph on that chart shows you the black lines, the peak that inflation reached in each of these countries. The red dot is basically the actual level of inflation. So you can see how in almost every country in Latin America we have seen a very important decline in inflation. Obviously, if you take the case of Brazil, inflation going all the way up to 11%, now getting very close to 2% on the lower end of the inflation range of the central bank, but something very similar is happening in Colombia, Costa Rica, Chile, Paraguay, etc. And that has opened the door, as you can see on the other graph, basically for the central banks to significantly reduce interest rates. The same thing. The black line shows you the highest level that the real policy rate reached, and then the red dot shows you the current level of the real policy rate, really showing you significant declines in real rates in Latin America in the last 12 to 18 months. Almost every country in the region faces an important challenge going forward in terms of fiscal consolidation. I mean, what that graph tells us is basically the significant deterioration in the primary surplus that has taken place in every country in Latin America, and what part of that has already been corrected by the red diamond. You can see the case of Brazil, I mean, with the deterioration of your primary balance of between 3 and 4 percentage points of GDP, and some part of that already being corrected. You can see that in Latin America, maybe 20% or 15% of the deterioration has been corrected, but countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Ecuador, I mean, Argentina still have a way to go, and all the countries in the region, I mean, Peru, Chile, need to continue fiscal consolidation in the next 3-4 years, basically to reach a level in which they stop the increases in the debt to GDP ratio for the future. I mean, I commented on some of these risks in the introduction, but basically from outside, a sudden tightening of global financial conditions, shift to more protectionist policies, accumulation of financial vulnerabilities in China, extreme weather events basically for the Caribbean, uncertainty associated with the tax reform in the US, basically how firms might decide to shift profits back to the US, affecting the public finances in the region, but also maybe how some firms might decide to relocate back to the US, given a more benign corporate tax regime there than what they were facing before. From the international financial cycle point of view, this graph tells us that really we have not seen yet the tightening in financial conditions. The first graph basically tries to show different tightening cycles in the US. So the purple dots is basically the 1999-2000 cycle. The blue one is the 2004-2006. And basically we are showing the federal funds rate on the horizontal dimension and a financial conditions index in the vertical line. What you can see is up to this point, the increases in federal funds rate have not materialized in a tightening of financial conditions when we look at all the asset prices. So eventually for this tightening cycle to start affecting aggregate demand, inflation and growth, we will need for that to happen, and obviously when that happens, some effect on capital flows, exchange rate volatility, etc., will affect the region, and that's a little bit what we have been seeing in the last 4 weeks. Which are the countries that are more vulnerable? That's a little bit what we have on the other graph. Basically those countries that have significant external financing needs, and more than that, that have a low level of international reserves. So they have a lower level of buffers to lead with this shock. It's important to say that the floating exchange rate has been an extremely good instrument to help these countries accommodate to this shock, but also having a large amount of international reserves has been very important to guarantee investors that the country has the financial resources to actually weather a significant tightening of global financial markets for a long period of time. This has been a blessing in the case of Brazil. I mean, in the last few years, going through significant domestic and external shocks. I mean, the liquidity provided by a significant cushion of international reserves has given investors the tranquility to think that the country will have the time to manage its problem. And we're seeing a little bit the opposite effect on Argentina, a country that had no reserves 2 years ago, in which the government depleted the assets of the economy, and the current government was trying to rebuild them, but in the process of rebuilding them, they were caught in the middle with the tightening of financial conditions that we're seeing right now. Argentina is trying to rebuild its fundamentals floating the exchange rate, but still with a high level of external financing need, and as you can see in the graph, with a low level of international reserves, and that's why now they're trying to manage that, and that's why they approach the IMF for an IMF program to complement their own reserves with an IMF program that will strengthen policies and will strengthen their liquidity position. As I said before, I mean, trade tensions, it's another source of uncertainty. These graphs just illustrate how much would tariffs in the U.S. might increase if the U.S. moves to a MFN tariff to vis-a-vis the Latin American economies, and what would happen with imports coming from the U.S. into these countries if these countries impose MFN tariffs. We'll see tariffs increasing between 2 and 6 and 8%. As an example, I mean, we use our models to simulate what will be the impact of growth for the Mexican economy and for Central America of these type of increases in tariffs. For 3 years, we will have growth below what we were projecting first by a slightly larger amount that have a percentage point, and then going back to the original growth rate that we have in a horizon of 3 to 5 years. As I mentioned before, the U.S. have moved its corporate income tax rate to the median rate that we see on the OECD economies, but also that will open the door to some multinationals to replan their tax strategies, and that might affect some countries through some base shifting back to the U.S. and make public finance slightly vulnerable in Latin America. In the graph on the right, what we show is how important is the income coming from multinationals in Latin American economies, both from the point of view of the economy as a share of GDP, but also from the point of view of total corporate income tax revenues. You can see in the Mexico columns that Mexico collects almost 23% of all its corporate income tax from U.S. multinational, and therefore is a country that is more vulnerable in this sample to these important changes that have taken place in the U.S. corporate tax recently. And I mean, as I said before, I mean, this is a year in which it is hard to expect important structural issues in Latin America, given that we have a very heavy political calendar, together with relatively weak, from the point of view of, let's call it, presidential approval ratings, governments currently in Latin America. The chart on the right shows you the highest peak of approval rating for each of the governments and the current level of approval. You can see, for example, in the case of Colombia, a peak of 80% of President Santos, but now, I mean, President Santos having a 20% approval rating, and basically, I mean, almost all the presidents in Latin America are having approval ratings of 20 or lower than that, and the electoral calendar that I mentioned at the beginning, with elections starting with Colombia on the Venezuelan election, the Colombian election in July, the Mexican election, October, the first round in the Brazilian elections. Let me just close by saying that, I mean, the biggest challenge for Latin America is basically to accelerate growth. We're not expecting growth to go beyond 3% on average in the region in the next 5 years, and therefore to really improve on the social indicators in a way that society is demanded. Latin America needs a much higher rate of growth, and that should come from policies that will significantly increase investment that is low by international standards in Latin America, policies that will increase productivity in Latin America. You can see some examples of structural policies where the lags in Latin America are huge, like education. I mean, standardized exams in Latin America are among the lowest in the world, showing that education is not an issue of resources. You can see, I mean, with the circles in the middle graph, that Latin America spends as much or even more than other emerging markets in education, but gets the worst standardized results. And still, trade openness continues to be relatively low in Latin America, so therefore, I mean, the agreement between Mercosur and the European Union is a very important first step. More intra-regional openings and integration should be good, and more unilateral openings should also be good. Sometimes, I mean, given the urgency of the resumption in growth in the region, waiting for the slow movement of international negotiations in some cases might not be the best strategy. And just let me close with another important both social and economic factor that is hindering growth in Latin America, that is crime. I mean, Latin America is the region of the world with the highest crime rate. I mean, you find, the top cities in crime, violent crime rates in the world. And on top of being a very important social issue, it is an important economic issue. You can see how, according to our estimates in some countries, reducing significantly crime rates in Latin America could help in increasing growth rates between 20 and 35 basis points in the future. You can see how, for the case of Brazil, moving the crime rate to the world average, according to our estimates, could increase the rate of growth by 25 basis points. Just summing up, Latin America is coming out of the recession. Governments are concentrated in consolidating macro stability by consolidating public finances and taking advantages of their financial strength and the declining inflation rate to lower interest rates. But on the back of this, there is the medium-term challenge of significantly increasing the growth rate in Latin America, and for that, important structural reforms such as investing in infrastructure, improving education, continue the fight against corruption, and significantly strengthening the rule of law will be key for Latin America to accelerate its rate of growth. Thank you very much.
Always great to be safe in New York, especially when you live in Rio. Cesar asked me a very simple question. He said, Langoni, please, I think everyone is interested in knowing who is going to win the Brazilian election in October. I said, well, that's a real challenge, But I can comment on the economic scenarios, and I think that Alejandro has given a very interesting background for Latin America. I'll try to emphasize the drama of Venezuela. It's unbelievable that a country with such natural resource can be destroyed by bad macroeconomic management, by extreme populist policies. And I do hope that this will have an impact, and for sure is having an impact on other Latin American countries. I'd like also to mention that for us it's a great honor to have here the president of the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, Carlos Ivan Simonsen Leal, that has led the foundation to be the 7th best managed think tank in the world, and to have the mayor of São Paulo, Bruno Covas, which, by the way, is a very good example about political renovation in Brazil, Bruno. Congratulations. A young mayor with open mind, clear ideas about privatization, concessions, and all. I think your leadership is very important for every other mayor in Brazil. Anyway, let me first begin with the good news. The good news is that the recession is over. Last year, Brazilian GDP grew by 1%. This year, we should move ahead around 2.3, 2.5, depending on the estimates. But anyway, it is still a slow pace. It's a gradual recovery. It's not a fast recovery, but the interesting point is that it is a steady process. In other words, there is no risks of discontinuities. On the contrary, we were seeing a transition from a consumption-led growth and recovery towards, an investment-led recovery. And this, of course, is fundamental to assure a new sustainable level of GDP expansion. As you can see, and I think Alejandro has explained as well, the Brazilian growth is well below world GDP average, is well below emerging countries, pace. So it is below potential GDP, which, by the way, is an interesting challenge, because if we have proper policies ahead, that means that Brazil can grow much more than just 2.3, 2.5%. Now, what are other good news? I think the most impressive result, in my opinion, is the sharp decline on inflation. Brazilian inflation is at historical low levels, and that is an important achievement for Brazil. And let me point it out, this is not only the positive results of the super safra, that we have had last year. Again, this year is going to be also very impressive, agriculture production and results, but also is the result of extremely well management of expectations, done by the central bank under the leadership of the new president, Ilan Goldfein. So that means that we have now inflation running below 3%. That's a very impressive result. It's about the United States inflation. Free market inflation is below 1%. Service inflation, that used to be very rigid, is around 3.5%. So all those numbers show that this is stable, that should stay at this low level for some time. And even when the economy picks up gradually, hopefully next year, we have good chance of having an unusual combination of the economy recovery associated with low levels of inflation. Of course, expectations are also well anchored. And because of this decline of inflation, the central bank has been able to cut down dramatically the basic interest rate, our Selic, also to a historical low levels. Next week, the central bank should probably implement another additional cut, bringing the Selic rate to 6.25%, which is a very interesting number. That means that the real rates of interest in the Brazilian economy are also at a very low level, around 3%. And this, of course, this environment of low inflation and low interest rate explains, together with macroeconomic policies which are consistent and have been focusing on fiscal austerity, explain the Ibovespa boom. Just to give an idea, in May 2016, when the new economic team led by Meirelles took power, the Ibovespa was running around 45,000 basis points. Now it's running about 85,000 basis points. So this is a very, very interesting result. Is of course a concrete evidence that despite all the political turmoil that Brazil is experimenting with 2 legal actions against the president, the market has discounted these political tensions until recently and has bet that Brazil is moving into the right direction. I would give you, by the way, as a parenthesis, a good example of how political change do make a difference. Look at Petrobras. Petrobras was a symbolic case of a state enterprise that had been destroyed by politicians and systematic corruption. When there was a change in management, when we have executive directors and the board, including the board of administration, appointed by technical criteria, Pedro Parente did a fantastic job. The turnaround of Petrobras is now an example of how this is possible when you have a different approach to state enterprise in terms of compliance, in terms of governance. Petrobras is now leading the stock market boom, is back to be the most valuable corporation in Latin America. And of course, all this associated also with the market-friendly regulatory framework for oil and gas. Brazil did an amazing mistake. During the recession, a deep recession, we have frozen the oil and gas sector with a completely unviable regulation that was imposing to Petrobras to be the sole operator, was imposing unrealistic content, domestic content requirements that has basically eliminated any foreign interest for the Brazilian very rich pre-salt. Changing the regulation, changing the Petrobras governance. Here we have a boom again in the oil and gas sector, with companies like Exxon that has been outside Brazil for many, many years, back investing risk capital, a sizable amount of capital. Almost every major foreign multinational group interested in oil and gas is back to Brazil. So that gives an example of the change that are happening in the country. Then you could say, well, if this is so impressive, we should give a lot of credit to the government Temer. Huh? Well, Brazil is a complicated country. By Datafolha last polls, President Temer is the least popular president in the direct democratic elected era of Brazil. He is least popular than even Dilma and Collor, believe it or not. This reminds me of a great composer of Brazil. Janete likes him very much, Antônio Carlos Jobim. Brazil is not for beginners. And also has some very interesting political implications. There is not a direct relationship between the economic recovery and the political scenario. In fact, there is one drawback in this recovery, which is the still fragile labor market. Despite this gradual expansion, which is more balanced from the sectoral viewpoint, services lagging behind, unemployment is still very high level, around 12%. And social mobility has suffered, the impact of this deep recession, the worsening of income inequality. I think those elements will be weighted against, this scenario of a gradual recovery and low inflation, and probably will be part of the electoral discussion. Now, looking about elections and all that Cesar asked me to comment something about. It's a very complicated scenario. We have a very fragmented election system. Today, currently, we have about 17 candidates. 17 candidates. I'm here excluding Lula, the ex-president Lula, of course. Joaquim Barbosa, the ex-minister of the Supreme Court, has resigned. He said he's not going to compete. Other outsiders have not also participated. But in any case, we have a great number of candidates. And that means that the race for the second round will be decisive. It will be extremely difficult to know beforehand who is going to be in the second round. In general, the poll shows that Mr. Bolsonaro, Mr. Ciro Gomes, Marina Silva, and probably the candidate from the PSDB, probably Alckmin, they should be competing for the second round. But it's going to be a very tight race. Remember that this is going to be the first election without private funding, which is now prohibited. Corporates cannot finance, the elections. It's going to be an election with a very short period of exposure of the candidates through the open TV and very limited time depending on the proportion of each party in terms of federal deputies. So it's going to be a very complicated situation. We don't know yet how the internet is going to affect, the impact on the elections. But the good news, and this is something that I would like to call the attention is that the macroeconomic situation of the country is much, much better than, for example, the 2002 elections. I made here a comparison just to remember. Remember that the 2002 election, we had at the end, in second round, Serra competing against Lula. I took May of 2002 and compared with the May of 2018. In GDP performance is very similar. But when you look at inflation, inflation was very high and rising. When you look at interest rates, the Selic was at 19%. Now we have Selic at 6.25%. When you look at the external situation, the current account deficit was almost 4% of GDP. Now it's 0.5% of GDP. Brazil has a very solid external account situation. The exchange rate was on a depreciation trend, moving from 2.5 to 3.54. Today we have some pressure on exchange rate, but nothing similar to what was happening in 2002. I do not believe that the real, despite the devaluation of around 9% this year, will suffer too much because of the cushion represented by the successful external adjustment. And in terms of even the fiscal situation, we had a primary deficit of almost 5% of GDP. Now, we still have, this is our great challenge. The primary deficit is around 1.6%, 2% of GDP, but is much lower. And the country's perception. At that time, we had, this is our CDS spreads, over 1,000 basis points. No, the market was betting on a possible Brazilian debt restructuring, or at least internal debt restructuring. And now we have the country's perception in the range of 300, 350 basis points. So what we should expect in terms of the elections? In my opinion, the severe fiscal constraint, the sharp and critical example of the populist disaster during the Dilma era and the Venezuelan tragic experience, in my opinion, minimize, independent, whoever is going to be elected president, the odds of an heterodox approach to the Brazilian economic scenario. So I'm betting on a basic scenario that the elected president is going to be a candidate probably from the center left or center right, that will follow up responsible macroeconomic policy, that will have to face the Social Security reform anyway. There is no degrees of maneuver to postpone this fundamental reform any longer, that will open up the Brazilian economy. We are too close economy, just 27% of GDP. It's excessively close. We need to open up, and it's a multidimensional opening of the economy, not only to trade, but to investment and to technology. And that's fundamental to increase investment ratio and to increase productivity, thus leveraging GDP potential. So, in short, Brazil is in a challenging year. Elections are coming up. Those are elections not only for the presidents, but also for state governors and federal deputies, for the Congress in general, including the Senate. So it's going to be a complicated outcome. We don't know yet who is going to be in the second round. But when you look at the economic advisors, Persuarida working for Alckmin, Paulo Guedes working for Bolsonaro, Marcos Lisboa working for Marina Silva, and Nelson Marconi working for Ciro Gomes, I don't see really any radical approach, any incompetent or inefficient strategy for development. I think everyone is very much aware of the seriousness of the Brazilian fiscal situation, the need to increase the space for private investment, a new wave of concessions and privatization, because the state in Brazil has basically broken. Look at Rio. You are aware of the Greece experience, dramatic cuts on pensions. Rio has suspended payment of pensions for many, many months. The Brazilian, the state capacity to manage basic public goods such as health and education has been completely destroyed. So we have to rely on the private sector. If we want to go back to fast, sustainable growth, there is only one option, which is to open up the economy, to follow a liberal strategy to growth, and this is going to happen independent of who is going to be elected. Thanks so much.
Good morning. It's great listening to all the commentary. I'd love to ask Alejandro a question about Argentina as it relates to Brazil, since it's their largest, Brazil is Argentina's largest trade partner. If you could give us some commentary on that, please.
I mean, obviously the interactions between Mercosur partners and between the two largest economies in Mercosur are very important. We haven't worked out the details yet, obviously, of the current Argentinian situation. Even for Argentina, I mean, this has been too sudden. It will be extremely speculative in the middle of the current turmoil to understand what will be the effects of the significant tightening of financial conditions in Argentina. Even for the Argentinian economy, we need to wait a little bit more to see how where these things settles. And then to work out the implications for the Brazilian economy, especially, I mean, from the trade tourism channel. On the financial side, we're seeing basically a common shock affecting emerging markets throughout the world, coming from the tightening financial conditions with the U.S. Treasury, 10-year Treasury rate, I mean, going above 3% is some of the past few days. And obviously, as I said before, the most vulnerable and dependent on capital inflows countries such as Turkey, Indonesia, and Argentina suffering the most. So I would say it's too early to work out the implications. It will be, I mean, irresponsible from the IMF side to come out with numbers in terms of the impact of this on GDP growth. Now, as you know, I mean, the Argentinian authorities reach out to the IMF to negotiate a standby agreement, and we're waiting for a board meeting to take place this Friday. That was announced this morning to start negotiations with Argentina. But obviously it will have implications. We haven't seen financial contagion. I mean, we have seen a common shock affecting all the emerging markets, but no financial contagion.
Another question? Please.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Next.
Me?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Ricardo Leopoldo, Agência Estado. Mr. Berman, can you talk a little bit about the IMF position about the Brazilian election, how that would harm the economy if the next president don't follow the major reforms, fiscal reforms that there, especially like the Social Security reform?
Well, I mean, as we have said in our last few studies of the Brazilian economy, I mean, Brazil has a very delicate fiscal situation. I think the key weakness of the Brazilian situation, as Carlos' presentation highlighted, is fiscal and growth. On the fiscal side, the path chosen, I think, is the right one of a gradual fiscal consolidation that takes into account the stage of the economic cycle in which the Brazilian economy is in, but with significant institutional underpinnings, such as the constitutional reform that puts a ceiling on the growth of expenditures, and secondly, of strong medium-term reforms, such as the pension reform, to really go into the entitlements problem that the Brazilian economy has. So in that sense, if these issues are not tackled, I mean, at the end of the day, we will be seeing the debt to GDP in Brazil, cross the 100% mark, and obviously getting the Brazilian economy in an extremely difficult debt situation and into a debt crisis that it can manifest itself in different dimensions and significant pressures for the central bank to maintain a low inflation, to significant closing of international capital markets that will affect refinancing of debt and eventually contaminating the domestic market. And all of these will translate into negative growth and a significant period of recession in the Brazilian economy until these problems are addressed. I think the key weakness of the Brazilian economy is fiscal, and I think the current administration has found a way to convince the market that Brazilian society will be able to tackle this problem in a gradual way. If this confidence is broken, I think we will see significant problems materializing in the fronts that I described, and I fully subscribe with what Carlos was saying on the medium-term growth problem of the Brazilian economy that needs to be tackled with significant structural reforms to increase the investment rate, to increase productivity, and that comes across with a significant opening of the economy, a significant internal liberalization of the economy, simplifying taxes. So the agenda is really large, and therefore it's not only, I would say, the pension and the fiscal, but the mandate that the next government needs. It's a very important transformational mandate for the agenda that has been laid out by the current administration to be implemented as fast as possible in the next 4 years.
Thank you. Lagone?
Alejandro, let me add something very important that I did not have time to present. When you look at the data, and Alejandro knows this quite well, at central bank interest rates, future interest rates, they do point to a sharp rise, especially in 2020, 2021. As a matter of fact, the DI rates are close to 9%. What that means? That means that the market does not believe that current rates, interest rates, which are so important for development, including development of the capital market, to make it the investment more viable and important, they are not sustainable unless there is the complementary of the fiscal adjustment. This is what the market is saying. So this is why I believe that at the end of the day, the next president will be forced to do what needs to be done. You know, an agenda reform, starting with Social Security, tax reform, opening up the economy, because there is no way out. It's as simple as that. And by the way, the pressure will be felt also, and Bruno Covas knows this quite well, at state levels. All the newly elected governors will face, in most states, severe fiscal constraints. So there is no room for populism any longer. I think we have experimented the disaster of the Dilma policy, which led the country to 3 years of the deepest recession in the Brazilian history. So I think there is today a political consensus. And as I see the candidates, everyone is, at least in terms of economic advice, thinking in the right direction. Of course, some have have the different approach about the role of states in the economy. Some are more liberal, some are more, relatively more still want to rely on the state. But at the end of the day, I don't think how they can get out of this fiscal constraint, severe fiscal constraint at federal level and at state level and at the municipal level also in many, many cities.
Thank you. Please. Sorry.
Well, maybe I should not say this because, after all, everyone likes to invest in Brazil. Next president, when he is elected, it is very likely that he will not belong to a big party. If it is Bolsonaro, for instance, his party is very small. He doesn't have political support in Congress. If it is Ciro Gomes, then maybe he won't have such a big support either. The biggest parties will probably shrink, but they will, some of them will continue to be the biggest parties. MDB will continue to be the party which ideology is not to have an ideology, and we will continue in the same non-cooperative game. Moreover, 60% of a congressman will be new in Congress. And you expect the new president to come to an agreement regarding fiscal policies within 2 months after he has arrived. None of the candidates has the capacity that Temer has showed for dealing with Congress. And Temer wasn't capable of dealing, was capable of dealing with Congress until corruption charges were made against him. But none of the candidates that are running is known for having this capacity. Moreover, we are going to have a degree of renovation in Congress that hasn't happened before. It's going to be over 50%, it's going to be around 60%. We want the new president to come to an agreement and fix what? We have made a promise of a fiscal adjustment 2 years ago, which works as follows. This government was not going to do anything, really. The fiscal adjustment belongs to the next president. So, what we will start asking soon enough is that promise credible? If it's not, how are we going to get out of it? Of course, inflation dropped. It's a huge success. But we have 13.5% unemployment in Brazil, and this is going to have an impact on elections. And maybe the huge success will not be such a huge success afterwards. The United States, and Alejandro was quite of skipping that question, may have overstretched its economic cycle, and one day or another will start going down its economic cycle. And this will have an impact in Brazil. If that couples with decrease in the rate of demand of China for our products, maybe we'll have problems in Brazil. For sure we will have problems in Brazil. So it is a risky situation where we are going to face a very strong stress test. Fortunately, we have $400 billion of reserves. The central bank hasn't been fooling around as it did in the past with too many swaps, has not been swapping so much with the exchange rate. There is space, of course, to raise the interest rate. There is space, of course, if there is a crisis, to negotiate the pensions problem. But it will be difficult. Moreover, extreme reliance on ad valorem taxes has made Brazil the dreamland of oligopolies. We have oligopolies for everything. It's not because we have a closed economy. The US is pretty much a closed economy too, 10% of openness, 15. It's about the same as in Brazil. It's the reliance of ad valorem taxation in Brazil that has pushed us toward this oligopoly wonderland. Every sector in Brazil is oligopolized right now because of this. And what is the way out? If we want to open, but the world is closing itself, no big deal. We will have to do a reduction on federal and state and municipal expenditures. That reduction can be done in two ways. One, the old way, is to have some inflation and not to correct the expenditures afterwards. Difficult. The other one is to do like Portugal did, like Greece has tried to do, less successfully than Portugal, is to cut pensions by simply cutting the number. Just say, I received 100 yesterday, today I'm going to receive 70. This is not so easy, because in Brazil, a large part of the middle class is linked to the public service, and they control the state. And they are not going to allow this without a fight. So this is going to be a challenging time. What do we have in our favor? Well, the Brazilian economy has been undergoing a very strong, silent restructuring that has nothing to do with the government directly. It has been provoked by the government. Banks are efficient. Most of the medium-sized companies are efficient. They can survive. We have to take more care of the small enterprises. We have to take good care of unemployment to reduce it. We cannot stand to go to 15 or 16% unemployment and just believe that this is a number only. It's not a number. It's much more than a number. It's a social conflict on the loom. So this is our challenge. The next government will have to balance between being liberal, opening the economy. Also, he will have, and I'll be criticized for saying this, he'll have to take into account that Brazil was built in a certain way, and it still works in that certain way. So the big positivistic machinery is still there. It has to be put to work in order to reduce unemployment in the short run, so that you may make the transition to a more liberal society. It is difficult, it is tricky. It's not only economics, it's sociology, it's political science, it's a lot of negotiation, and above all, it requires a view of project management that we have lost. Brazil built some of the biggest infrastructure projects in the 70s in the world. Much of that culture is gone. The people that did it are dead or retired, old. And we think that we can still build Itaipu as easily as we did? Probably not. So that is our challenge. Fortunately, we produce food, a lot of food. The Chinese, Asia needs food, and maybe that can save us. Don't count on minerals forever, because the cycle of India will not start strong before the cycle of China has finished. So, but we may count on food. Thank you.
Thank you. The last question.
Good morning, Marcos Trujillo. Two questions. The first addressed to Alejandro and to Professor Langoni. Although I acknowledge that there's more political nuance when it comes to what the candidates are saying, those who are running for president, it is true also that when it comes to their economic advisors, one of them, for example, wishing to allow for reindustrialization of Brazil, advocates the use of exchange rate and, of course, devaluing the BRL as one of the pillars for the intended deindustrialization. So my question is, what are the chances you see that a measure such as that will bring about more macroeconomic imbalances before it actually allows for reindustrialization? And the second question to Mayor Covas, if he could go further on his ideas on how to make São Paulo as a powerhouse for both exports and investment attraction. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Well, this debate about exchange rate policy, I think it's a very important one. By the way, I did not mention the candidacy of Meirelles. I think it's very interesting to have Meirelles, even though in the polls he's moving around 1%, doesn't matter. I think if he can participate in the debate and to explain the legacy of the Temer government in terms of macroeconomic policy, I think is going to be a tremendous contribution. Now, one of the great advances that Brazil has made in terms of economic policy has been to accept the concept of a floating exchange rate. Of course, it's a dirty floating as in any other country in the world, but it's floating. The experience with fixed exchange rates were tragic. Remember, the first mandate of President Cardoso, we had to go to the IMF because of the inconsistency between the fixed nominal exchange rate and growing public sector deficits. So if you have a fiscal imbalance, it's impossible to think about any fixed exchange rate. As a matter of fact, it's interesting because you are mentioning the debate between Marconi and Pércio Arida. Pércio Arida gave a very sharp interview at Valor, support the idea of a floating exchange rate, and then criticizing a proposal made by Marconi on behalf of Ciro Gomes that he tried to fix, to depreciate the exchange rate to a level that would allow the Brazilian reindustrialization. This is a very old-fashioned idea. My position is very clear. I think Brazil needs more competition, not more protection. I think the Brazilian, of course, we need to do this side by side with internal reforms, especially the tax reform that Carlos Ivan mentioned here, and it's fundamental to increase competitiveness. We need to invest in infrastructure, but the things must happen simultaneously. To think that the exchange rate can solve competitiveness is a basic mistake, and I don't believe this will fly. As a matter of fact, Nelson Marconi has comment back saying that he was not support this idea, probably because realizing that this is completely out of question. I think it's unacceptable from any angle, to think about fixing again the exchange rate. By the way, the government can only fix the nominal exchange rate, cannot fix the real exchange rate. So we have learned a lot with this question of exchange rate. We have a very good regime. By the way, we have a central bank, and I like the idea of Pércio Arida that if Alckmin is elected president, he would keep the same board of the central bank. That's a very clever idea to give stability. The central bank knows how to manage exchange rate. As Carlos Ivan mentioned, there is no excessive intervention, there is no excessive swaps. He's allowing the exchange rate to adjust in a moderate way because of this new external environment, especially the possibility of the Fed speeding up the normalization of monetary policy in the United States. So I think the idea of having an independent central bank, this is a relatively easy reform to be approved and could be approved still during the term of government, would give a lot of, would reduce a lot of institutional uncertainty, because we need to have central bank well managed, and these directors, have a lot of credibility. They are doing a fantastic job, both in managing the exchange rate and, of course, managing inflation and expectations. So I do hope this idea will not fly, will not resist to any debate.
A minute to complement on that. I think one of the most important changes we've seen in all of Latin America is the move towards independent central banks, inflation targeting, and floating exchange rates. I mean, who would have thought that Brazil could have been able to go through one of its deepest recessions in modern history, the political crisis that it went through, the collapse of investment without a sudden stop of capital flows, without a financial crisis. And I think a lot of that has to do with this model, I mean, together with very good regulation of the financial system. And as Carlos was saying, I think thinking that playing with nominal variables is a way, is a shortcut to get substantial transformation in an economy. I mean, I think that has tried before in Latin America. It never ends well. So I fully support what he said. I mean, as Leal was saying, I mean, there's very deep transformations that need to be done in Brazil, as in many other economies in Latin America, and it will imply significant political, social, and distributional debates that in a democracy are costly, are slow, and hopefully could be accelerated with a strong mandate. But to the extent that the direction is clear and there's important movement, I think hopefully some of these issues will be tackled in the next administration.
When you talk to an audience where you have Brazilians and Americans, is that, as I said before, there are different underlying assumptions. In the US, there is a certain type of budgetary process which is a necessary condition for having a sequence of good budgets, whatever that means. It's not a sufficient condition. Sufficiency comes out of politics, but the necessary part is there. So you can have a sequence of good budgets. Not only that, as in any democracy, the budget is a result of interaction between the executive and the legislative power, and once it's fixed, the public policies, the national strategy that implies the budgets, once that is fixed, the budget is followed. It is like this here in Germany and other parts of the world, the democratic world. In Brazil, the same is not true. Our budgetary process has had this very smart invention of saying, well, that is just an authorization. Whatever the government sends, and Dr. Murilo Portugal was around here, maybe he has already left, he used to say when he was Secretary of the Treasury, I owe $1 more, each time $1. I am always quoting you. He said, the budget that is sent by the government is irreal, and the one that comes out of Congress is surreal. And that's mostly true. Because of a rule that we have, no one has a compromise to have something serious. That thing that is approved is not going to be followed. You may put $100 billion in education. The government, the federal government, will spend as much as it finds suitable. It cannot spend more than $100 billion, but it may spend 50. And of course, if you had a set of public policies seriously designed for $100 billion, and you decide to spend 50, something is not going to be done. So the first thing is there. And you say, well, it's just a question of democracy. No, it's much more than that. It's much more than that, because you don't manage to have a profile of indebtedness, a sane profile of indebtedness, with our budgetary process. Germany is very strict. The US is less so, but the US has a navy, so it creates international liquidity everywhere. It's another story. But we don't have a navy. We don't create international liquidity. The real is not the reserve currency of the rest of the world. And therefore, we don't have, because of our budgetary process, we don't do, as Germany, we don't have a sane profile of indebtedness. Of course, me, as most of the Brazilians here present, they love LFTs, which is a letra financeira do Tesouro, a bill from our Treasury that has this fantastic feature of having a one-day duration. You see, interest rate goes up, the price immediately adjusts. It's fantastic. It's a quasi-money. 36% of our debt nowadays is still made of LFDs. So you see, the underlying hypotheses are completely different. How can you have credit if you have this term structure of interest rate and indebtedness profile behind it? Private savings here, they pivot towards private investments. I can go to a bank, and my son lives in the US, he works for a company, the guy from the bank, he's always dealing with this guy, called him and said, and he's 30 years old, whenever you want to open a business, we have $500,000 as credit for you to open the business. That thing doesn't happen in Brazil. No, private savings don't go to private investment. It's safer, and it's also profitable to lend it to the government, to pay wages, to pay taxes, to pay more interest, not to put in anything productive. So, because private savings don't go to private investment, we are also astounded when we realize that we don't have enough investment in innovation. The Brazilian government invests as a percentage of GDP the same number as the US government, 0.75%, 0.8% of GDP. The big companies invest about the same amount proportionally of the American big companies. But the rest don't invest because they don't have credit. They don't leverage. So the big step for Brazil, and when I say Brazil, if Brazil does this step, is capable of doing it, all of South America will do it because all of the economies will converge to ours. It's quite obvious because of the size. The big step is a leverage step. How do we leverage with our own resources? We have to have a better budgetary process. The thing is, we have a bad budgetary process. We know what's a good budgetary process. The big deal is not to know the steady states. The big deal is the transition between one state to another. You see, here in the US, there was once an itemized budget. It was a complete disaster. This was in the 19th century. People tend to forget. This was 100 years ago. The US, Great Britain, the UK, Germany, they have committed many mistakes and they have learned. We are learning. Only we are learning in a more competitive environment, and we are entering world competition without being prepared for it. So, new president, I hope, will try to follow this path. It's not clear in Brazil that we have to, first of all, no magicians, no big economist that's going to be the guarantor of a country. His ideas are the guarantee of a country. It's institutions that are the guarantor. Congress and the executive power. That we have to follow a better law. Second, we will have to have a transition. And during this transition, no tax reforms. It's impossible. Why have we always failed in tax reform discussions? It's very simple. You don't do tax reform when you are in a deficit. You do tax reform when you are in a superavit, because tax reform implies a risk of taxes falling. You don't know how the machine is going to get money from people. So this is a discussion. The big point, pension reforms. Pension reforms has to be, unfortunately, has to be harsher, and it has to be fast. If we do that, foreign investment will come with a signal that the real question is the build-up of a term structure of a sane structure of term structure of interest rates, then we will leverage. Because foreign money won't come to invest alone. It will come to invest with Brazilian money, and there is plenty of Brazilian money. We just have to organize ourselves in order to leverage on our own money. Thank you.
Thank you. To finalize, I will invite Mr. Covas, the mayor, to say some words about São Paulo.
Acho que o papel da Prefeitura de São Paulo pode se resumir em dois grandes desafios. O primeiro deles é demonstrar que há vontade política. A privatização foi demonizada no Brasil durante muito tempo. Era um assunto proibido para os políticos. Durante muitos anos, somente pós o governo Fernando Henrique, alguns governos promoviam e vem promovendo privatização e concessões de forma tímida, né, como se fosse algo escondido, sem fazer a defesa pública disso. E pela primeira vez nós tivemos na cidade de São Paulo a eleição de um governante, aliás, pela primeira vez na história recente do país, eu diria, um governante que prometeu durante a campanha privatizar. Aliás, foi a primeira vez que se elegeu um prefeito na cidade de São Paulo em primeiro turno, desde que o Instituto de 2 turnos foi criado na década de 90 para a eleição de prefeito. E na campanha, o prefeito João Dória prometeu privatizar basicamente 3 itens. O Pacaembu, o estádio municipal, o AMB, espaço de convenções, e o Interlagos, o autódromo. Durante o início da gestão, em janeiro do ano passado, foi possível, vamos dizer assim, repactuar isso com a sociedade, com a aprovação de um plano de metas que foi aprovado na Câmara Municipal, em que se estabeleceu um programa ainda maior de desestatização da cidade, com a criação, inclusive, de uma secretaria, está aqui o secretário Wilson Poit, que cuida exclusivamente desse grande programa. E o programa passa hoje de 50 itens em que buscamos essa parceria com o setor privado. Mas além, é claro, da vontade política, acho que o papel da Prefeitura é ter bons projetos. E isso se garante, em primeiro lugar, fazendo a coisa o mais transparente possível. Então, onde a legislação estabelece uma audiência, a gente faz 2, 3. Quando a lei pede prazo de 30 dias, a gente dá 45, 60, para que não haja nenhum direcionamento, para que não haja nenhum questionamento. A gente faz todo tipo de discussão com os parceiros institucionais, Câmara de Vereadores, Tribunal de Contas, Ministério Público, Governo do Estado, Governo Federal. Quer dizer, não há nenhuma ação que é tomada sem a devida cautela de conversar com todos os setores públicos envolvidos. E quem conhece o Brasil sabe o emaranhado de leis e regras que nós temos, até para que isso não tenha nenhum questionamento futuro. Todos os projetos estruturados com os devidos estudos, para quem não tenha licitações desertas, para quem não tenha nenhum tipo de ação sem a devida cautela de levantamento, que há interesse do setor privado, que não adianta o setor público inventar a necessidade de uma desestatização se não tem interesse do setor privado de cuidar de equipamentos como esse. E estamos criando, inclusive, uma parceria com o BID, um pequeno grupo dentro da Secretaria de Desestatização, que vai funcionar como uma pequena agência reguladora para todos esses projetos. Estamos estruturando essa agência com a devida cautela para que ela não seja partidarizada ou politizada no futuro. A gente fala de projetos de 30, 35, 50 anos, a gente está falando, claro, de projetos que vão passar desta gestão. E aí não pode correr o risco de que no futuro isso vai ser prejudicado. Então, acho que do ponto de vista institucional, o papel da Prefeitura é esse. Demonstrar que há vontade política. Não é à toa que eu vim para Nova York exatamente para isso, para demonstrar que, apesar da saída do prefeito João Dória, o governo é um só, não é um novo governo, é o mesmo governo. E que nós temos a clareza de que temos bons projetos para que o investidor privado possa investir com a devida tranquilidade nesse programa da Prefeitura. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Muito obrigado, prefeito. Thank you, Mr. Werner. Thank you, Mr. Leal. Thank you, Ms. Langoni. And thank you all for coming. And I hope to see you next year at same local, same structure. Thank you. Bye-bye.